Slave breeding was one of the most brutal and calculated systems of exploitation in American history. It wasn't about survival or family. It was an economic strategy designed to multiply enslaved labor after the transatlantic slave trade was banned in 1808. When importing Africans became illegal, plantation owners across the southern United States faced a new problem. Their labor supply was shrinking. Their solution was horrifyingly simple: breed new slaves from the ones they already owned. Slave breeding meant forcing enslaved men and women into sexual relations to produce children who would themselves be enslaved for life. These children were born into bondage and counted as property from the moment they took their first breath. For slaveholders, every new birth meant profit, another set of hands for the fields, another human body to sell, trade, or exploit. Enslaved women were not seen as mothers or wives, but as reproductive assets. Their ability to bear children was deliberately manipulated, tracked, and monetized. Owners calculated their value based on how many children they could produce. Enslaved men were often selected for physical strength or specific traits and forced into breeding arrangements without consent, stripped of dignity or emotional choice. Records from plantations, slave markets, and advertisements make this reality undeniable. Listings for enslaved women frequently included phrases like "excellent breeder" or "likely to have many children." The humanity of the enslaved was erased. They were turned into instruments of production, their most personal and sacred acts reduced to economic transactions. This first chapter isn't just about defining a term. It's about confronting the industrial scale of dehumanization that underpinned American slavery. Slave breeding was not a myth or an exaggeration. It was a deliberate, organized, and profitable system that shaped generations. After the U.S. officially banned the importation of enslaved Africans in 1808, slaveholders across the South faced a crisis. The foundation of their wealth, free labor, could no longer be replenished from abroad. Rather than confront the immorality of slavery, they turned inward and transformed human reproduction into a business model. Slave breeding became an intentional economic strategy designed to maintain and expand their labor force without depending on the Atlantic trade. The Southern economy revolved around crops like cotton, rice, sugar, and tobacco, all brutally labor-intensive. As demand for these exports grew, plantation owners needed more workers. But instead of paying wages or reducing workloads, they exploited the bodies of enslaved people to produce a self-sustaining supply of slaves. Every child born to an enslaved woman meant a new laborer, a new profit center, and a higher total plantation value. Slave owners began tracking birth rates as carefully as they tracked crop yields. Young enslaved women were especially prized because their fertility represented decades of future profit. Auction records and plantation logs often described women by their reproductive capacity, using words like breeder, likely wench, or prolific. Enslaved men, meanwhile, were evaluated for strength, stamina, and perceived virility, reduced to nothing more than biological resources. This economic system was as methodical as it was monstrous. Some regions even specialized in producing slaves for sale to other parts of the South, creating what historians later called slave breeding farms. Virginia, Maryland, and parts of Kentucky became hubs of this internal slave trade, exporting men, women, and children to the Deep South for labor in cotton and sugar plantations. These sales often broke families apart forever. What makes this chapter so disturbing is how rationalized the cruelty became. Slaveholders justified forced reproduction, not as abuse but as management. They wrote about it in ledgers, discussed it in agricultural journals, and treated it as a necessary economic adjustment. Behind every number in those records was a human life, conceived in violence, born into bondage, and raised to labor for someone else's wealth. If slave breeding was the machinery of profit, enslaved women were its engine. Their bodies turned into factories for wealth they would never see. They bore the heaviest burden of this system, enduring not only forced labor, but also sexual exploitation that stripped them of privacy, dignity, and choice. To their enslavers, a woman's value was measured by the number of children she could produce, not by her humanity. Enslaved women were coerced into pregnancies through violence, manipulation, or direct orders. Their consent meant nothing. Slaveholders paired them with men of their choosing, often multiple times, to produce stronger or more desirable offspring. In many cases, these women were also victims of sexual assault by their masters themselves, a grotesque abuse of power justified under the law. The children born of these rapes were enslaved too, even when their fathers were the men who owned them. Frederick Douglass, one of the most famous abolitionists and a former slave, recalled the agony of his own family. He wrote about witnessing the brutal whipping of his aunt, punishment not for defiance, but for existing under the control of a man who saw her body as property. His words capture a truth many enslaved women lived daily. Their pain was public, their bodies owned, and their cries ignored. Harriet Jacobs, in her autobiography Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, revealed the mental torment of this exploitation. She described being hunted and harassed by her master, Dr. Flint, and the impossible decisions she made to protect herself and her children. Her story exposes a reality that history books long sanitized. Enslaved women weren't only laborers, they were prey in a system that commodified their fertility. Even pregnancy didn't shield women from brutality. Many were forced to work in the fields until childbirth and returned to labor within weeks. Infants were often taken away and sold, severing the only bond these women could claim as their own. The cycle was cruelly efficient: force conception, extract labor during pregnancy, and profit from the sale of the child. This chapter isn't about isolated acts of cruelty, it's about a system that institutionalized rape and reproductive exploitation as economic policy. Enslaved women carried both the physical and emotional weight of slavery's greed, their motherhood weaponized against them. While enslaved women endured the physical and emotional devastation of forced reproduction, enslaved men were also trapped in the same machinery, stripped of humanity, and used as instruments for breeding. Slaveholders evaluated them like livestock, selecting those with the strongest physiques, the most endurance, or the best health to improve the enslaved population. Strength, not consent, determined who would be chosen. Their masculinity was reduced to reproductive potential. Their bodies turned into tools of economic strategy. These men were often forced into sexual relationships with women they did not know and could not refuse. Some were made to mate repeatedly, treated as studs or breeding stock. The process was clinical, transactional, and humiliating. They had no power to protect the women involved, no right to form families, and no claim over the children born from these forced unions. Even love, when it did exist between enslaved partners, was fragile, easily destroyed when a master sold one to another plantation. Historical records show that slaveholders kept track of which men sired the most children, sometimes rewarding them with small privileges like extra food, lighter work, or new clothes. These so-called rewards only deepened the psychological damage, turning fatherhood into a competition and denying men any true agency over their own lives. It was a cruel manipulation, using the natural desire for family and survival as a means of control. The emotional toll of this system was immense. Formerly enslaved men who later wrote or spoke about their experiences often expressed shame and grief at being forced to participate in such acts. Some described the unbearable pain of seeing their children sold or their partners assaulted, powerless to intervene. For many, manhood itself was redefined under slavery, not by honor, protection, or legacy, but by the owner's command. Slave breeding corrupted every aspect of human connection. It robbed men of fatherhood, women of motherhood, and children of identity. The enslaved man's body, like the enslaved woman's, became an object, bought, used, and discarded in pursuit of profit. The system didn't just exploit labor, it dismantled the very idea of family and humanity. Among the most twisted aspects of slave breeding was the system of rewards some plantation owners gave to enslaved men for impregnating multiple women. It wasn't enough that their bodies were exploited, their humanity was manipulated too. Slaveholders used perverse incentives to turn reproduction into a competition, offering trivial privileges to men who could father the most children. What they called rewards were little more than psychological traps that deepened control and division within the enslaved community. These incentives ranged from extra food or clothing to small reductions in workload. temporary comforts that came at the cost of moral and emotional degradation. Some men, desperate for even slight relief from brutal conditions, complied out of survival. Others resisted internally but had no power to refuse. Either way, the system corrupted relationships, destroyed intimacy, and weaponized sexuality as a tool of domination. Historical records expose the plantation owners who bragged about these breeding achievements. James Henry Hammond of South Carolina, one of the wealthiest slaveholders in the antebellum South, meticulously documented his breeding experiments and the rewards he offered to enslaved men who impregnated the most women. His writings reveal a chilling mix of arrogance and depravity, proof that these practices were not rare aberrations, but deliberate strategies used to expand wealth and control. Thomas Nicholson, enslaved under John Randolph of Virginia, was reportedly given small privileges for fathering numerous children across the plantation. Yet even those so-called favored men remained property, subject to beatings, sale, or death. Their status never rose beyond the cage of slavery. Their success as breeders only meant deeper entanglement in the master's profit system. The psychological damage of these practices was profound. Enslaved men were stripped of their right to love, their families fragmented, their children sold. The rewards dangled before them were poison, designed to twist natural instincts for connection and fatherhood into tools for exploitation. Every child born under these conditions reinforced the slaveholder's wealth while deepening the enslaved man's despair. Slave breeding didn't just destroy bodies, it shattered the core of manhood, family, and selfhood. By turning reproduction into a contest, it robbed men of their purpose and turned survival into complicity. This was control perfected. Domination not only of labor and flesh, but of the human spirit itself. Slave breeding wasn't just about reproduction, it was a calculated extension of the slave market itself. Every birth meant potential revenue, and every womb was treated like an investment account. Enslaved men and women were bought, paired, and sold with the same logic used for livestock, their value determined by how much labor or offspring they could produce. This was capitalism stripped of morality, an economy built on human flesh. Plantation owners and traders assessed people like inventory. Women were advertised in newspapers as good breeders, likely wenches or fine stock. Men were marketed for their physical power or their record of fathering children. Children born into slavery became the next generation of forced labor, proof that the system could perpetuate itself indefinitely without importing another soul from Africa. The trade turned into a closed loop of cruelty, where human reproduction became a commercial transaction. Virginia, Maryland, and Kentucky became key centers of this internal slave trade. Slaveholders in these states bred enslaved people specifically to sell them farther south, to the cotton and sugar plantations of Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama. The Upper South supplied human lives as if they were commodities, fueling the agricultural wealth of the Deep South. This second Middle Passage, as historians call it, tore apart hundreds of thousands of families, marching them in chains across state lines to lives of unending servitude. One of the most tragic symbols of this reality was Margaret Garner, an enslaved woman who in 1856 killed her own daughter rather than allow her to be returned to slavery. Her act wasn't madness, it was the desperate logic of a mother who understood exactly what awaited her child, a lifetime of rape, breeding, and sale. Garner's story forces a confrontation with how utterly hopeless the slave market made the concept of family. Auction houses across the South routinely listed people by age, health, and breeding potential. A young woman with several healthy children fetched a higher price because she had already proven her fertility. Buyers calculated the profit each could generate through future births. It was a grotesque intersection of economics and biology, every intimate act reduced to monetary gain. In the end, slave breeding revealed the true nature of slavery itself, not a system of labor, but of ownership so total it claimed even the right to create life. The enslaved weren't just exploited for what they could do, they were exploited for what they could produce, generation after generation. If the slave market was an industry of flesh, its cost was paid in broken families. Under the system of slave breeding, love, marriage, and parenthood had no legal standing. Enslaved people could form emotional bonds, but those bonds existed only at the mercy of the owner's profit motive. A man could wake up one morning to find his wife sold to another plantation. A mother could give birth and see her child taken from her arms within weeks. Family ties were not recognized as sacred. They were seen as inconvenient obstacles to commerce. Plantation records and auction documents make this brutality explicit. Families were routinely listed separately in sale ads. Strong field hand, age 30, his woman, 28, and 2 children available separately. It was business as usual. Traders knew that selling family members apart could increase revenue by appealing to different buyers, so they divided them strategically. A mother's grief, a father's desperation, a child's terror, none of it had weight compared to profit margins. The emotional toll of these separations cannot be overstated. Former slaves who lived to tell their stories described the trauma with a clarity that still wounds. Henry Bibb wrote of watching his wife sold away to another man. Harriet Jacobs recalled hiding in an attic for 7 years just to remain near her children. Countless others spoke of the haunting silence that followed an auction, the emptiness of the cabins, the screams fading into distance. Family was the only form of humanity many enslaved people had left, and even that was systematically destroyed. Children born into this system were taught early that affection was dangerous. Many learned not to grow too close to siblings or parents because they knew separation was inevitable. Mothers sometimes withheld emotional warmth, believing it might make future losses more bearable, an unimaginable sacrifice of tenderness in the face of certain heartbreak. Slaveholders knew this psychological destruction helped maintain control. People without family ties were easier to dominate. Some enslaved families did manage small acts of resistance. They held secret ceremonies, exchanged tokens, or carved hidden marks into trees near the plantations as symbols of belonging. These quiet gestures were acts of defiance, proof that even under total oppression, the instinct to love and remember could not be fully erased. Yet for most, the reality was unrelenting loss. Slave breeding didn't just steal labor, it dismantled the very idea of family and continuity. It turned human connection into collateral damage in an economy built on ownership. Every forced sale, every separation, was a deliberate act of psychological warfare designed to crush the enslaved spirit. At the heart of slave breeding lay violence, not incidental, but systematic and intentional. Plantation owners didn't simply encourage reproduction, they enforced it through intimidation, rape, and physical coercion. Enslaved people were denied even the right to control their own bodies. Refusal wasn't an option. The master's command carried the weight of law, and disobedience was punished with whipping, starvation, or death. Historical records and diaries reveal how calculated this violence was. Some owners literally forced men and women together under threat of beating, standing watch to ensure compliance. Others treated sexual assault as routine, particularly with enslaved women they found attractive. The result was a system where pregnancy itself became evidence of abuse. The line between breeding and rape didn't exist. They were one and the same. Few examples capture the scale of this cruelty more starkly than the records of Thomas Thistlewood, an 18th-century Jamaican overseer who meticulously logged decades of violence and sexual exploitation. Between 1750 and 1786, Thistlewood recorded thousands of assaults and hundreds of forced births, documenting it all as if he were tracking livestock production. His journals expose the cold precision with which human lives were reduced to numbers. Births, pregnancies, punishments, deaths, a ledger of suffering disguised as management. Enslaved women endured these assaults while still expected to perform heavy labor. They plowed fields, harvested crops, and carried loads until childbirth. Rest was rare. Many were sent back to work within 2 to 4 weeks after giving birth. Infants who survived were often weaned early and sold off, sometimes before they could even walk. For the mothers, each pregnancy brought both grief and guilt. Grief for the child who would live and die in bondage, and guilt for being forced to bring that life into such cruelty. This cycle created a self-sustaining machine of enslavement. Every child born under this system automatically became the property of the owner. Freedom was never inherited. Captivity was. The child of an enslaved woman was enslaved by law, a doctrine that guaranteed endless generations of bondage. Birth itself became a mechanism of control. The psychological scars were just as deep as the physical ones. Enslaved people lived in constant fear of separation, of violence, of being forced to violate others. Slave breeding turned human relationships into weapons and destroyed the possibility of intimacy without terror. It stripped people not only of their liberty, but of their capacity to feel safe in their own skin. When viewed in full, slave breeding exposes the core truth of American slavery. It wasn't merely about forced labor. It was a total system of domination that reached into the most private corners of human life. The violence that sustained it didn't end with a beating or a sale. It echoed through generations, reshaping lives long after the physical chains were broken.